Greetings, everybody, and welcome back to This is Revolution. My name is Jean Badgelan, in tonight for Jason Miles, who is taking a well-earned rest. Now, before we begin the show and we bring on our guest and the co-host for this evening, the one and only Pascal Robert, I would like to remind people to like and subscribe, hit the bell, all the usual things, leave a comment, leave an abusive comment, because, even abusive comments help us in the algorithm. And in fact, there's nothing more enjoyable than watching Jason get very irate early in the morning because somebody's called him something offensive in the chat. It's like, look, guys, it's the comments. What do you expect? But we have an exciting and very interesting and I think very important story tonight about big tech, Ivy Leagues, the plunder of Africa, the dreams of a better education, all combined into one story, the story of Bridge. And we're going to be talking to Ryan Grimm and also Neha Wadekar, who wrote a wonderful article in The Intercept about this. I'll get that up on the screen for everybody so that we can all have a look at this. Excuse me. And we'll be dissecting this. The link is in the doobly-doo, so people do go and read this article, because I do think it was a really important article. But before we bring our guests on, of course, I know you don't come to This is Revolution to see me. You come to This is Revolution to see the one, the only Mr. Pascal Robert. Pascal, how are you doing this evening?
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings to you. Greetings to you, Jean Badgelan.
It's been a while since we've been on the front lines together, Pascal. It's good to be back on the hog. Is that the phrase?
Absolutely, and I think this is a subject matter that we're both finding quite interesting, and with this wonderful article that our guests have put together here.
Yeah, I mean, I truly found this article like deeply disturbing, like the whole story deeply disturbing. So I want to bring our guests on and really get to it. So, of course, we have Ryan Grimm. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me here.
And we have Neha. Welcome, Neha. Thank you again, who is joining us from overseas, and it is very late at night for her. So we really do appreciate. I didn't think she was going to be able to make it on, but I'm really glad you could join us this evening as well, because this piece that you guys wrote was really a fantastic piece. So just so we have some context, let me read a little bit from this article. In the early years of the Silicon Valley disruption, two Harvard graduate students dreamed up a bold experiment in education. Shannon May, who studied educational development in rural China, and her husband, Jay Kemmelman, an education software developer, spied an untapped opportunity for the moving fast and breaking things going on all around them. And what, you may ask, was that opportunity? Well, it was selling education to Africa. And the result of this was the formation of this company called Bridge. So Neha, could you give us a little bit of a context about how this came together, what this project was, and sort of how it developed so rapidly? Because within less than a year of landing in Africa, in Nairobi in Kenya, they're setting up schools. So what was the philosophy behind this? What was the disruption that these people were doing?
Sure. Yeah. Well, these two founders, Shannon and Jay, basically took a look at the education landscape, and they saw this huge opportunity to educate young African children from low-income neighborhoods. And I think that's really key when we look at the stories, that these are not only young African children, but they're particularly vulnerable because of the background that they come from. Most of these kids live in what is referred to as slums in Africa, but these are densely populated informal settlements. They tend to be higher crime rates, younger dropout rates, early pregnancy. This is the background that these kids are coming from. So, they looked at this and they were like, okay, there's a need for these kids to be educated. And they decided to create a chain of for-profit private schools that they would offer at a very, very, very low cost. And so when it comes to this, like you think about, okay, if we're going to be charging kids the tiniest amount for education, but we need to keep the schools going, how exactly are we going to do that? Well, with volume. So they needed to expand. They needed to get as many kids on board as possible to make the kind of money they wanted to make to give a return to their investors. And they were able to basically raise money from all of the biggest names in the game, right? You've got the Zuckerbergs, you have the Omidyars, and they also got funding from places like the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, which is the lending branch of the World Bank. So really big, significant investors. And on the face of it, the education that these kids were getting had really good outcomes. And the way they did that is they took a curriculum that was developed in the halls of Cambridge, Massachusetts, where these guys had gone to graduate school. And it was a good curriculum, good lesson plans. Although if you talk to people in the countries that these kids are in, there's pretty diverse opinions on the education that's being offered. And we can come back to that. And they standardized that and they put it on a tablet. And so they handed these tablets out to teachers at the schools. And basically, these teachers were meant to read word for word from these tablets. So it was like, this isn't the kind of learning that you'd see in a private school in, let's say, the United States, which is small classrooms, dynamic back and forth discussions, that kind of creative learning that gets kids to think independently. This is like really rote memorization. And once they had that formatted, once they had this tablet learning, as we point out in the story, and Ryan and I looked at this pretty closely, that education really didn't need to be taught by teachers at all, right? Because if you're reading off a tablet, you don't need to be a teacher. You just need to be able to read. And so that was, did I just cut out, guys?
Nope.
No, you're
okay,
still there.
great. I saw like a little
Yeah.
swirly thing. So yeah, so that was, that's the basic premise, right? Is that you've got these kids that are being educated, teachers reading off a tablet, classrooms that are getting bigger and bigger, more and more students getting enrolled, and that's when quality starts to slip.
So there was some kind of quality at the beginning of the project, but as it scaled up, it was not a scalable, it was not scalable, or at least it couldn't be profitable at scale. Ryan, do you want to take that?
I mean, if you think about what they can charge these children, we're talking about $5 to $8 a month. You then start, in order to make a profit, you have to then be running these classrooms, at less than $100 a month, all in, and that's the teacher pay, or the instructor, or whatever you want to call them, the reader.
Mm-hmm.
That's the corporate headquarters. That's the schoolhouse itself. So that was another place that they cut a lot of corners. Chicken. They call them chicken coops for kids in some of these areas. Just chicken wire, a little bit of concrete, mostly wood and kind of tin. And then that's it. Like, so how do you turn a profit with that? And the only way to do it is absolutely massive scale. They're talking about 10 million, trying to get to 10 million kids, so that you're actually seeing numbers that are going to kind of justify the investments that these investors are looking for. Because while it was the Zuckerbergs, Gateses, Omidyars of the world, the kind of do-good financiers, the ones who go to Davos and talk about how they're going to do good and do well, it's their for-profit arms. It's not like it was the Chan Zuckerberg like grant making operation, or the Gates Foundation. That's just, you can have lots of criticisms of what they're doing, but they're giving that money away. They're trying to make money on these investments. And so if you're only charging a kid $5 a month, you got to put that education together for $3. And that's where the danger comes in.
What was fascinating to me that I want to talk about is that how they're so overt, particularly in their Harvard study, where they say that they want to have a McDonald's-like kind of like academy in a box in terms of how they refer to these kinds of these institutions. And did any of you realize, or did you think about how there was so much symmetry behind the rush to neoliberalization through the charter school movement in the United States and what they're trying to export in terms of this African model, and how a lot of the usual suspects like Nicholas Kristof, a lot of these same type of individuals who support charterization are supporting this new exported version in Africa. Did you notice a similarity in the synergy behind those two types of developments?
For sure. I'll start, Neha, and then you can go. On at least a couple of points, you saw a ton of parallels, and one was the specific people, like you said, like Nick Kristof himself. Wrote an article celebrating this and saying my liberal friends need to, not just dismiss this just because it's for profit. They need to understand that perhaps they have, these smart Silicon Valley people, maybe they have cracked this. So it was exactly the same people, but also the hostility to teachers unions was there, like that, like central to the Bridge International Academy's model was making sure that there were no teachers unions, and their biggest enemy, kind of, and as they see it as their biggest enemy is teachers unions in Africa, who from the very beginning were like, this is a complete mess. And you're right, they literally did call it an academy in a box. And the funny thing is, she even says out loud that they were originally going to call it a school in a box, but then they learned that in Kenya they called good schools academies. So they're like, oh well, we'll call it an academy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting actually. I think one of the other things that that we see as a parallel, right, is this idea of giving up on the public school system. And in Kenya, for example, like there are huge issues in public schooling. You've got statistics around teachers who don't even show up to class, right? And you've got all these kids who need an education. And the idea is kind of like, well, we're offering them something better than they would be getting in the first place. But then the question is, are you offering them something good, or are you just offering them something better than what they would get in the first place? And I think those are very, very different. And then when you look at the students, the demographics of the students who are being offered this education, the question arises, would we be having these conversations in a wealthy suburban neighborhood in Kenya, in Nairobi, for example? No, we wouldn't. And I think that's a really important thing to look at as well.
So there's obviously a class dynamic in this. This is because all over the world, the wealthy elements of the population in Africa, the Middle East, India, they get a good quality education, or they can access a good quality education. But this seems to have been like a very cowboy job. You have a quote here where May says, "We're technically breaking the law," right? Yes. So it's like, well, no, you're not.
You always like when you can get a quote like that.
I think she probably regrets that one.
But can you talk about how these guys were relating to the governments in these, what's the dynamic at play here? Teachers unions in the US, we know, often have a conflictual relationship with the government. In fact, often they're some of the strongest unions existing in the United States. Are there parallels in, are there dynamics in, for example, Kenya, a desire for the Kenyan government to break a powerful union and use this as a vector? Or is the Kenyan government being sold this as like a solution to what they see as an intractable problem? Or is it a bit of column A, a bit of column B? Can you talk about a little bit, how did they get away with breaking the law?
And so Neha would know more about this, so I want her to basically take this, but I would just want to lay out one parallel, which is, to me, Uber is a perfect example. And Uber, rolled out this model in the US, but then also very heavily rolled out this model in Africa, which says we're just going to break the law and we're going to grow so big that you have no choice then but to negotiate the terms of your own kind of government surrender. And I think you saw a similar thing unfolding here, but now I would know a lot about kind of the intricacies of how they navigated Kenya, also the other Africa that they eventually expanded into.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably slightly different in every country, and there's been a different trajectory in every country. One of the places that Bridge has opened and operated is Libya, and they basically had a completely failing public school system, and that in that situation, the government wanted them to come in. They essentially wanted to outsource their schools, because what the Minister of Education at the time said was like, we are in a situation where it is just simply impossible for us to get our school system up to the way that we want to run it. And the issue is so bad that we don't see a point really in continuing to try to improve our public schools. So rather than doing that, they decided to outsource, and they outsourced to a couple of different of these for-profit private chains. That's an extreme example, right?
I think you meant Liberia.
Liberia,
right?
Liberia. Sorry, excuse me. And that is an example, basically, of a government coming in and saying, we are almost done with our public school system, and you guys just take it over from here, kind of hands in the air. Kenya is a really different example because they do have a functional school system. They are a functioning government, and they do have the resources and the ability to kind of scale up and improve their existing public school system. But, oftentimes something is sold, as you were saying, as a solution, as a good idea. And I think in this situation, there are probably advocates who just think that this is the right solution. If you end up with the right advocates within a government system, they have a lot of leeway. And there are teachers unions, there are individuals, there are civil society and non-governmental organizations that are speaking out. But if you've got the right people supporting you, especially in a country like Kenya, especially in a lot of these African countries with very strong centralized governments, you end up in a situation where the school is able to operate with certain level of impunity, and there's not going to be an issue there.
Was also a factor the fact that the class makeup of the children they were dealing with, that in other words, because they were mostly poor children, they had a lack of agency in those of people who would defend them in the eyes of the elites in those respective governments. So as a result, it's easy to basically say, well, listen, it's not like we're going to put their issues as a priority, naturally speaking. So consequence is that it's a lot easier, and not to mention there's a lot of millionaires who are supporting this new kind of like privatized education. So there's also room for, capital to exchange hands and a few other things. Not that we're making allegations, but do you think that might have played a role as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that played a huge role. I did a lot of the reporting on the ground in these informal settlements, and there are some parents who don't even speak English. There's a lot of parents who can't read and write. And so you've got this very marginalized population with very, very little government influence, who are often seen as almost a nuisance in the eyes of the government, in the sense that, the issues and problems that they bring up can sometimes look more like a PR issue for the government than something that they might necessarily really want to solve. And that is a blanket statement. I mean, there are plenty of great people in the Kenyan government working really hard to solve issues in the informal settlements. But again, this is a population that has very, very little bargaining power. I spoke to one woman who was working as a laundress, for example, like she was doing like cleaning people's clothes, and she was at work all day. And, when we haven't even, kind of gotten to the crux of the story, but when she found out that her niece was being sexually abused by a teacher at one of these schools, she didn't even know where to go, because in Kenya, the police, especially for this population, are not seen as friends. They are seen as foes. And so she did not want to go to the police. And where is she going to turn? Where is her recourse? And she said that. I mean, she was sitting in this office that I was talking to her in, and she was crying. She was like, I feel so guilty. I feel so terrible that I wasn't able to do anything. But what could I have done? Who could I have talked to and turned to?
And one other key point that I think goes to what you were saying is that an argument we would come across from people who were critical or skeptical of Bridge, but were explaining why a government, Ugandan government, Kenyan government, didn't take tougher action against them. And it came down to fear of spooking foreign capital. So because they don't want to be tagged as a government that is hostile to foreign investment. Because they think that maybe will get run out of office, and this foreign investment will find somebody who is more friendly to foreign investment. But otherwise, there's this idea that you're not going to grow if you don't get foreign capital flowing into the country, and so the foreign capital has enormous amounts of power to operate within the country, because they you know, to me, let's say they fold. A lot of people would see that as a win. To a lot of people, they'd say, oh, now, okay, yes, we didn't like what that company was doing, but now we're going to get tagged as like, being unfair to foreign capital investment, and we're in trouble. And I think, and that's a power that capital has that is, outside of the law, but so strong that it can overcome a lot of laws.
And I assume that doesn't even have to be, directly
Exactly.
implied
Right.
by
It just
foreign capital.
is.
It just is. You know it. You know the risks of pushing too hard on these people, and
Especially Bill Gates, Mark
Yeah.
Zuckerberg, Piero Midyar, who, Intercept financier as well.
but I mean that's really comes down to it. This is something that Pascal and I were talking about when we were talking about setting up this show. Is like the buy-in from the international do-gooder elites.
That's something that really I wanted to really talk about, is that why are the intellectual and international power elite so vested in this kind of saviorism of African education and the attempts to step in? I mean, was it the profit margin? Or I sense it's got to be because Nicholas Kristof, he has this whole kind of like every time he literally said in an article that I like to highlight the role of the white savior in Africa. I don't know if you guys are familiar.
I didn't see that one.
No.
But he's actually said that in a quote, and I was like, what is with this guy? What are the ultimate motivations here? Is it pure profit, or is there another kind of? For example, one of the things that Gene and I were talking about with the scramble in Africa, the rise of China, even Russia in the age of multipolarity, is there an attempt to try to leverage cultural power via education in these countries by kind of controlling the worldview of the West and the United States? Do you see that as a potentiality? Can you guys give us more in terms of what is driving these power elites to be so interested in these educational outcomes in Africa?
And hey, how you run into a lot of them in Nairobi? What do you put them
Well,
on the couch for
I
us?
was, I mean, I was going to say, like, I think, money is part of it, right? The idea that you might be able to hit it big. Africa has the youngest and fastest growing population on the continent. So if you're able to tap into that, I mean, you've got a lot of potential in terms of earning. But also there's a glamour in it. And that seems strange to say, but you've got people who are kind of mini celebrities. Shannon May and Jay Kimmelman are based in Nairobi, and they, from all accounts that I've heard, Nairobi's a pretty small place, and they live well. And there's you're heralded for the work that you're doing as somebody who's coming in and seeing a problem and trying to fix it in a creative way, right? This idea of the disruptor, somebody who sees this issue that nobody else has been able to solve and then solve it. So I think, there is of course, there's a financial component to it, but it's also reputational. And it's, being able to go to these high profile events like Davos and having people say, oh my God, the work you're doing is amazing. And you're known as the people who are like the Africa people. And there is a component of that. And that cuts across a lot of people doing work in Africa. And I think that doesn't necessarily take away from the work that they're doing. These are issues, they do need to be solved, but there is a very complicated dynamic there between the people who are doing the solving and what they're actually looking for, right? There's this, this saying that everyone kind of quotes, right? Nothing about us without us. Like, these solutions are always better when they are homegrown and when they have African talent at the head of them. And when there are people from the communities who are able to look at these issues and say, well, actually, these kids don't need a Cambridge, Massachusetts education. They need a Nairobi, Kenya education. But that doesn't always happen.
Right. And yeah, so there's a hubris of these people coming in believing that they can solve, like, quote unquote, intractable problems, almost by imposing their own solutions from outside. And even if, they may be well-meaning at the beginning of it, it's the paradigm through which they're approaching this problem is in and of itself exacerbating this problem. and this is what I wanted to kind of come on to next, is like how this project obviously started to enter the dark side, and how we ended up this situation where you have these underqualified people, and then you have these completely, repugnant stories of mass sexual abuse.
Yeah, and it was nice that Shannon May had done several interviews about the kind of rise of the company. But Pascal pointed to the one that was like the MIT case study or something, where she talks about, by, say, I forget the exact years, but say like 2013, 2014, they're just growing exponentially. Boom. They're like, because they've got their software done, they got their little tablets, and then they have the design for the schools, like the 2 feet of concrete, the wood, the chicken coop, the roof, and they can just, without permitting, and if you don't have to worry about some of those things, you can move a little quicker, and boom, they're 100,000, 200,000, 500,000, 1 million. Like they're growing. And she says the biggest problem we had, was staffing up. Was keeping the qualified staff that could keep us, growing at the rate we needed to grow in order to hit the margins that we had promised investors, more or less. And instead of saying, okay, we've run up against a limit here, we have a problem, we need to figure this out before we expand quickly. There is no logic by which a company can do that and survive. Like you've got your investment rounds, and you have to be showing numbers, and so you're gonna push through with any of these barriers. And so you can just imagine what's going to happen. Like if you're if you're not able to kind of vet your teachers, or you're not necessarily calling them teachers in a way that would be required for kind of typical safeguarding procedures around kids, then you're going to have kids who might be at risk from some of the people that you're bringing into the building. And so but then kids, there are creeps and monsters everywhere. Yeah. There are scandals in some of the richest schools in the country.
In Britain,
Right.
There's just been a huge scandal about actually super elite British private schools. There's been this like mass coming out of people's like, oh, we were actually all molested at these like, 10,000, 15,000 pounds a term. So it can happen everywhere.
It can really happen anywhere. The question then becomes, how do you respond to it?
Mm-hmm.
And if you respond to it by just kind of keeping it moving, what messages does that send to other teachers or students?
So, I mean, how did they respond to this? Can you so as these stories started coming out, what was the response? How did the company respond? How did the investors, respond to all this?
So broadly speaking, so you have two competing stories, but what we know is that the when a student first tried to report that this serial abuse was going on to a number of different students, more than 10 at this one school that we focused on, nothing was done. She's told, don't say anything about it. She found another teacher later, and an academy manager, was what they call the kind of bosses of the school, were like, don't do anything about this. The next year they go to another teacher, and that teacher talks to, after getting an anonymous note, interviews a bunch of other, and when Neha's back, she can tell more of this because she did the on the ground reporting on this. Talks to a bunch of other girls at the school and finds many others that were also abused. Calls in, they call in the assailant and play for him the recordings that they have, because initially he's trying to deny it. Play from the recordings of the girls talking about it, and then they are the ones that take it to the police. Go ahead, Neha.
Yeah. I mean, this is kind of where things go off the rails, because the teachers kind of call this like all school meeting, right? And at the meeting, they end up reading aloud some of these testimonies, and I spoke to like some teachers who were like, we knew this teacher. And actually what was interesting is there was an amazing quote that someone said, that he was camouflaged in Christianity. And, he had this very overt kind of man of God persona that he was putting out there. He was a Christian religion education teacher. He was one of the local leaders at his church. I mean, he kind of gave forth this, I am unimpeachable.
I mean, I live in Southwest Missouri. That's like red flag, red flag, red flag. The most
Exactly.
dangerous person in Southwest Missouri is a youth pastor.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's kind of, it should have raised alarm bells, I think. But, Kenya also is a country which has a growing evangelical population. I mean, religion is really on the face of things all the time. And it's not unusual, people pray before meetings and they pray after a meeting ends, like a work meeting. Like if we were going to do this podcast, like we might have prayed in the beginning and the end. So that part of it is also kind of, you can see why people wouldn't find that to be strange. But then, so one of these teachers at the school meeting, she was like, I know this guy, like he's my neighbor, I trusted him, he's a church going man. And so she was like, I dropped to the floor. Like I was absolutely hysterical because I felt so betrayed. So, the other teachers in this situation were horrified. And I think this guy was preying on a demographic of girls who were so vulnerable. I mean, some of these girls were 10 years old. I mean, it's really like sick stuff. And, he was preying on these girls and he knew that these were girls who were not going to talk. And like, it's interesting. I did end up getting the opportunity to speak to some of the survivors, and, the girls that he chose were outcasts. They were loners. They were not quite comfortable in the space. He's not picking the top girl in the pecking order who's comfortable and confident and comes from a 2-parent home. He's picking the girls who are not that. And that was also, really disturbing. So in this teachers meeting, basically what happened is the teachers expected, they brought in the academy manager, the kind of principal of the school, and they expected her to then call the police. That was sort of what was supposed to happen. And what happened instead is she was really good friends with him. And so she ended up letting him escape.
And the key insight into what this tells us about kind of the way the company operates is that a lot of the changes and the responses that came from this incident came in 2020, but this crime spree was in 2016. And so then what happened in 2020? So and it also goes to kind of, and this will, I think, fits in the theme of some of your shows, goes to the shortcomings of kind of the ability of these financing institutions to regulate themselves and do anything other than what they're really doing, which is profiting. And so the IFC is the for-profit arm of the World Bank. Like it does it's actually trying to make a profit. And so in February, there was a investigator with what's called the ombudsman. It's like an internal investigative unit. The Army's got an IG, the CIA has an IG, trying to keep their house clean. So they're in Nairobi, investigating some other complaints that have been filed by organizations against this company. And while there, the investigator, and we know this from documents that have been subsequently been published, while there, the investigator learns that there have been some allegations of sexual abuse, and so that is then published in kind of an ombudsman report saying that we're going to look into this. So you see the changes that are made lining up more, I think, with the kind of the ombudsman of the IFC starting to look into this rather than the changes being made because something terrible happened. No, so that's 2020. That report is still not out. The IFC told us in our article that they expect it in the fall of this year. So that would be 3 years after the investigation began, and or at least 3 years after the investigation began. It may have been going on before that, and 7 years after. So Neha's talked to some of these. These are women now.
That was something that I noticed in your article, is the elaborate kind of weaving of names of individuals that are trying to go through to get justice for these girls, and there's always some kind of internal structural kind of obfuscation that's blocking any type of advancement. Can you talk about the process? And I also want to talk about the individual who was doing research for his PhD and how he was treated. By the way, that was another interesting part of the story. I found fascinating that if these schools are supposed to be doing all this great stuff, then why are they all of a sudden involved in trying to police and almost shut down anyone who's doing research on them? But yeah, if you can address those two things, I appreciate that.
That was an incredible story. This is a Ugandan, not Ugandan. He's a Canadian PhD student who was hired by a kind of international teachers union to do research into Bridge International Academies, and so he's in Uganda doing this research. His name's Curtis Reap. He lives way up in northern Canada now. I talked to him. He really wanted to put this behind him, but if you could get him to come on, I think it'd be a fascinating conversation. So he was doing a bunch of different research into the schools, reaches out to the Bridge executives, says, I'm in Kampala, would love to interview you guys for my research. They say, sure, happy to sit down. He shows up at the cafe. Two officials from Bridge also show up at the cafe. He hits record on his device, starts to start the interview. Then you look up and there's 3 police officers there. One of them, he said, looked like a plainclothes detective. The other 2 with like assault style weapons and like Ugandan police gear. And they're like, you have to come with us. And I'm like, why do I have to come with you? They're like, because you've been accused by Bridge of trespassing on their property and impersonating a Bridge staff member. And he's sitting there with a Bridge guy, and he's such a nice Canadian that he's just like, hey, great news. I'm here with a Bridge executive right here. Like, he runs this whole area. He'll tell you that this is fine. There's no problem here. I didn't trespass at all. And he's like, right? And we know exactly what was said because he had his recorder going. He's like, right? You're gonna tell him, right? Why aren't you telling him? What's going on here? And the guy just sits there, kind of refuses to intervene, and tells him, maybe you should go with these people. And eventually he does. They pick him up. They walk him out of this cafe. He is able to send an email, which he still has, of course, to his fiance while he's talking. Like, he told me he was just praying that like the internet continues to work in the cafe long enough, and so that he can stall long enough so that he can send this email and then hit send, and it goes out. So he tells her, like, I'm being detained by Ugandan police. I don't know what's going on. If you don't hear from me, he keeps saying in the email, I'm okay. But if you don't hear from me in 24 hours, please do something. And so they take him out, and he remembers driving past the kind of center city big police station and then continuing on. It's like, okay, why, if you're arresting me, why did we just drive past the gigantic police station? Where are we going? And they drive him several hours out into Uganda, into this little clapboard 2-room building, which has like a 1 cell and kind of an intake office. And there are 4 cameras there waiting, like, news cameras, to like film him and take pictures of him, to do articles about this like creep who's been arrested for trespassing on Bridge schools. They eventually did release him, and he quickly left the country. They then filed a complaint against him, claiming that he had impersonated people to get onto the campus. They were never able to produce enough. They were never able to produce evidence to the Ugandan police and the Ugandan police dismissed it. The University of Alberta dismissed it. They sent us a note that didn't have a name attached to it from somebody at a school saying that somebody had said that they were from the school, but there was no You know,
Yeah, it was
that's
like
all it was. Just
no
like
name, no date.
So it was like
just like
a complete fabrication.
could be.
Um,
They're also a litigious company, so I'm gonna say that
it, it,
this is what we know.
Yeah, I
right.
mean,
It's
yeah, no, go ahead.
allegedly.
Right.
Allegedly,
Yes.
it was he was being framed, at least according
It
to.
certainly appears that way. Yeah.
But we don't know how high up it goes in the company. For example, if it
Although they
were
also
to,
took, we do know that they took out, and to your point, they took out basically a wanted ad in the major paper in Kampala with his face saying that saying that this guy was wanted by the police for trespassing on school grounds, and that if anybody sees him, he should be reported to the police. As Curtis pointed out to me, that if somebody sees somebody like him who's been accused of trespassing on a school and thinks that he might be a creep, there's just as good a chance that he gets mob justice than as he gets
I mean,
somebody calling the police.
let's not beat around the bush. Like they're like implicitly calling him a pedophile.
Yeah,
I
right.
mean, that's what they're doing. That's like the dirtiest slander you can do on somebody.
Right.
And they're not doing.
Extremely dangerous. Like if he, that could have ended very badly for him because he didn't know until later that ad had been taken out in the paper.
And he was completely oblivious to this until the actual moment of the arrest. So this company has, let's be careful, has allegedly has some problematic practices, some allegedly has done some dishonest behavior vis-a-vis people trying to engage in perfectly legitimate investigations. What do you think they're so scared of? I mean, obviously we have the sex abuse scandals, and obviously, it's my general assumption that often with these big things it's the tip of the iceberg. I mean, it may not be. Hopefully it is just like one off, but very often it's not that. But what other things might they be concerned about the way that these schools are operating, do you think?
I mean, I think there's a lot of things, right? There's, for example, like Ryan mentioned, right, that when the CAO, the ombudsman, came down, they were investigating other complaints into the school. And, there have been multiple complaints filed through the IFC's compliance and, ombudsman. And these are issues that range from health and safety to unfair labor practices for teachers, right? I mean, there are people complaining about the quality of the buildings these kids are in, where they're built. I mean, some people told me that there were bridge schools that were close to dumps, let's say, or butcheries, and we weren't able to obviously track down every single campus, but we can definitely say that some of the campuses that we saw, that the photographer who worked on the story saw, were definitely not where I would want to send my kids to school, for example. And there are also issues around the way that teachers are treated and paid, right? Teachers work 6 days a week, extremely long hours. During holidays, they're actually out there as sales agents. They're expected to go door to door in these neighborhoods and get parents to sign up for the school. If a kid didn't pay their school fees on time, there was a grace period perhaps, but then they weren't allowed into the classroom, right? So you've got these little kids showing up at school and they can't go in and learn. So these were some of the complaints that we heard from people. Another thing that really kind of raised red flags, I think, for both of us was that people were absolutely terrified to talk to me. It took a lot of begging and pleading and cajoling to get even civil society to talk to me. And that was because of the reputation that Bridge has cultivated as a litigious and, sometimes kind of a company that really can exact retribution if they don't like what's being said. And so, that is another cultural kind of a part of the culture that they have put together. Another thing is, I spoke with, for example, a former HR manager who worked in the headquarters in Kenya. And, she spoke on background, did not want her name attached to it. But it was really interesting because she talked about issues that were happening even within the staff that was actually working in the office. So not the teachers, not the students, but even in the company's administrative staff, there were issues that were raised to her that were really problematic. So it sounds like, there were cultural issues across the board with the company, as well as issues around health and safety, labor practices, the way teachers are treated. Right. So then if you've got all of these things kind of circulating and you're trying to kind of keep all of these, groundhogs in the ground, then of course you don't want people showing up in your classrooms and taking pictures and asking questions.
And I think the other point would be, and this is probably obvious, that if you're relying on financing from do-gooder elites, reputation matters more than for a rubber for a rubber plantation, or let's say a copper mine or a lithium mine, because investors in those types of businesses are just used to exploitation, bad headlines, disasters, but it doesn't matter. Like you're just putting money in and taking stuff out of the ground and selling it, and as long as the numbers work out in the end, you don't care how many bodies are destroyed. But if you're selling the business model partly as making the world a better place, then things that are counter to that are a lot more dangerous.
And that's really what's so perverse about this story as well. It's like, I'm not going to defend the mining industry or anything like that, but it's like, it's the mining industry. We know what the mining industry, but this is like truly, hideous as it were. So what I wanted to ask, what's going on with Bridge at the moment? Because they seem to be weathering all this perfectly well. That their investors don't seem to be spooked. I checked their website today. It's all happy children, and and women in brightly colored clothes, and all that kind of stuff that we expect. The orientalizing images of Africa and India. What's going on with Bridge? You mentioned that they're litigious. Are you able to even talk if how they've responded to your piece, or what's going on with them now? Because this stuff is now coming out, because I saw there was pieces in the Guardian about this. It's not, one of the reasons we wanted to do this show is because I felt that this was such a important story of abuse that just I only knew about it because I happened to scroll on Twitter and see this article, and I was the article affected me. I was really disturbed by it because I've worked in education, and I've seen grifty education companies in the Middle East where I've worked before, but this was a next level of grifty education company. I was like, wow, this is this is like the secularization of the Jesuit model,
Yeah, and I think some of your question remains to be answered. I think we're working on a follow-up story, so that remains to be seen. At the World Bank's annual meeting, which was not long, maybe a month after our story came out, this Bridge was the big topic of conversation there, and there was a lot of pressure because one thing I'm really proud of the story for is the way that it kind of weaved together Neha's on the ground reporting with kind of the institutional reporting about the kind of clashes going on within the World Bank, because you have these all these different civil society groups trying to get accountability for the victims of this agenda, and I think that is moving in a direction that some of these organizations feel like they're going to at least have a better shot of getting elite justice for some of these victims. So we'll see. It's also a story that's easy to ignore. For there's a lot going on in the world, and we know that, and I think that a lot of companies that operate in Africa count on short attention spans from the West about anything that goes on there, and just kind of chalking it up as, oh well, that's unfortunate. What a shame.
Do you think there's any possibility of bringing accountability towards the individuals behind this company in the U.S. or in the West at all?
I think it's possible. I think we'll see where it goes, but yes, I do think it's possible.
Well, that would be a nice happy ending to the story, I have to say, because like it, well, so for the last 10 minutes, I kind of wanted to ask you guys about what you feel that this story tells us, not just about like Western attitudes towards Africa, but about political culture, about because I just felt this story had so many different, it had so many different threads through it that were like really disturbing, but seemed like very familiar. And like we're talking about these, there's a lot of talk today about AI solutions to everything.
The
And
role of the foundation as the development model
Mhm.
for the world is something that goes back to the 19th century. And what to me was very interesting about this particular story is it demonstrates how we're still stuck in that model, but we're just using more kind of the new neoliberalization, if you will, of abandoning the public functioning of the state and just infusing capital to solve everyone's problem on the cheap, when at the same time the damage that it causes is not even being fully investigated. So what does that say to you guys as journalists about where we are in terms of the role of capital and the state in the global south?
Yeah, to me, unless you want to go first, Neha. Like to
No,
me,
go
what
for
I
it.
liked
can go
about
after.
the story is that if somebody asked you kind of what is neoliberalism, what is neocolonialism, you could just kind of show them this story, like this is it, top to bottom. It has every element of it, like Harvard mingling with Silicon Valley, putting together what they think is a tech utopian, what they claim is a tech utopian solution, but which is ultimately just a way to try to extract profit out of the most immiserated people, like not the ones that you would be able to walk through these informal settlements and think to yourself, here's a business opportunity for me. Like I'm going to extract wealth out of this. It's just kind of a stunning mindset. But like you said, is hundreds of years old. It's just getting a kind of tech update, and some of the glossary is more sophisticated and able to be bandied about in Davos in ways that make people feel really good about themselves, whereas there might have been more of a raw power attitude a couple hundred years ago.
Yeah, also, I think, what's one of the things, and you alluded to this earlier, when we zoom out of this, is that there is a battle for power over Africa, on the African continent, right? You have Russia coming in with, great military might and offering, the services of its, its kind of mercenary groups to interfere in domestic disputes in particular countries, and as reporting shows, in exchange for, let's say, mining rights for precious stones. You've got China, which has its Belt and Road Initiative, which is putting in infrastructure all across the continent, and often the way that is financed ends up putting the African governments in a hole that's so deep that it's going to be difficult for them to dig out of. So, when you look at this idea, it feels almost like a very American solution, right? Is that like, we're going to come in and we're going to kind of do good and solve your problems. There is a very robust aid community, humanitarian aid community, but then you've also got these for-profit solutions that, again, like feel very Western, feel like, okay, well, if Russia's doing this and if China's doing that, like we can come in and do this. And I think, it does end up in the kind of grander scheme of things playing into this battle for power over, again, like the fastest growing population, youngest demographic. And of course, as we know, the continent with the most natural resources that we need in order to make our electric vehicles and to move forward as you know, a society, is like, we need the minerals under the ground, we need the trees, we need all of the things that Africa has to offer, but the power
And
dynamics are very
I'd add,
skewed.
and maybe this is obvious, but it's also a just complete rejection of an attack on kind of the public space. Like if let's like because Bridge will tell you that its curriculum, its software tablets are making it so that kids are reading at learning to read at a faster rate. This making these other gains at a faster rate. You do find kids who will say that they like the education that they got there. Let's say, just for the sake of conversation, that all of that is correct. Their methodology is right. They actually are educating these kids better in this particular way. It doesn't have to be a for-profit venture that smashes teachers' unions and that pushes the safeguarding down into the ground, creating risky situations. We didn't even talk about the kid in our story who got electrocuted because there was a live wire dangling down and died.
And then
Their
died.
defense
And
was,
died.
well, that
Yeah.
live wire was hanging down from the neighboring property. And it's like, well, if in my neighborhood a kid got electrocuted at school and the principal was like, sorry, that's not our fault, that wire was hanging from the neighboring property into the school, the parents would be like, you have to be insane that you think that that's a defense. In any event, you don't have to have it. If the curriculum's great, then go ahead, like use the curriculum. You don't have to also graft on this privatization model unless that's really your goal, which it is.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because we can debate the merits of these kind of fatty new education methodologies that people come up with. Some of them may be okay, some of them may be less okay.
If it's good, great.
Right. But yeah, I think the question is, those things are never deployed in isolation. It's not like curriculum is the be all and end all, even, because with education, there's to do with like after school care, there's to do with buildings, there's to do with whole infrastructure, and this it is very, like, it's a very technocratic issue way of looking at it, isn't it? It's like, well, they're obviously not doing it right. We're going to come up with this like narrow technocratic solution, and that's what we're going to focus as our selling point. And I think it's really, another thing is really important. They walked through this poor neighborhood, these people, they say it openly, and they saw this as an opportunity for us to make money. And that's a sicko mentality, if you ask me. A real, like, I don't mind people making a little bit of bread. It's fine. But when it comes to, I mean, like, when you see poor people suffering in like the most deprived parts of Africa, and you think dollar signs start appearing in your head, there's something wrong with you, right? There's something wrong with you. And as our good friend on this show, Deep State Cuba, says, Deep State Cuba, a Harvard graduate himself, the culture there is all about, like, it's all about making money. If you end up working for the deep state, like Deep State Cuba, you're the loser of the group, because you should be going into like the profit making things, right? So yeah, I mean, it was. I really want to thank you guys for doing this kind of reporting and getting these stories out there, because, and I hope we can have you guys back on when you do your follow up story, because like I think Pascal and I definitely want to keep up with this story, and make sure we're following the developments. Pascal, any final questions or comments?
I really appreciate your reporting on this story, guys, and thank you very much for being attentive to what's going on in terms of Scramble for Africa on these different planes.
Yeah, thanks for having us on. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Well, anything you would care to plug on?
Not at the particular moment.
Neha, you're doing some podcasts now, right, or something?
Oh yeah, you're doing podcasts. You're in the podcast.
Yeah, doing a bit of podcasting with a newish media organization based in the UK called Project Brazen. So we do some pretty cool stuff. So everything from the real story behind Havana Syndrome to the story of a cocaine empire in Europe. So
I heard about this.
Really
I've heard about this cocaine empire. So I was back in the UK, hanging out with my brother, and I was like, what are people doing in the UK these days? Because back in my day, it was all, getting drunk at the pub.
Warm beer.
Warm beer. No, but
And your
He
brother
said,
said
no, he said,
cocaine.
there's cocaine, but there's something called bash, which is cocaine mixed with like speed, because cocaine's expensive. And he said, like, yeah, all the kids are just vaping and taking cocaine, and cocaine was like unknown like back in the day in Europe. But like there's like one flight a day from Caracas to Istanbul, and why are people going from Caracas to Istanbul so much? So it's some good questions to be had. So yeah, we'll definitely do something. We'll get the Project Brazen. We'll put the link in the description. We'll definitely have you over there. Oh, we got a super chat. What's the super chat? Solidarity from Liverpool. UCU Industrial Action. Shout out to Liverpool. Never understand what anybody from Liverpool says, but congratulations. But yeah. Neha, Ryan, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and we do hope to have you on again in the near future. And Pascal, do you want to say the 16 magic words of TIR?
We are out.